Okay, so I'd like to just introduce this session as to its purpose. So we're here to actually find out what it's like to be a member of council in our little community and soon to be a somewhat larger community over the next couple of years anyway. And so we're here to try and see what people may fear, what people may anticipate. You've been there, you're relatively new, you're probably going to remember everything on the learning curve. So what we're really trying to do here is introduce the role and see if we can attract some potential candidates to this upcoming election here.
Yeah, and I appreciate you guys doing that, because I've always said anybody who wants to run should do it. And I was there a couple of years ago. There's a big swallow to jump over that ledge, and honestly, I know I'm not running this year, but it's not because I didn't enjoy it. So so I highly encourage everybody to give it a shot. So.
Well, that's great. So just before we get into that, I'd like maybe to have you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience. We don't need your full history, but your Turner Valley history or your community history here in the Diamond Valley, as I guess it will become. I know you're a close neighbor of mine, so I see little munchkins running around.
Yeah.
Tell us about your coming to Turner Valley.
Yeah, so my wife and I moved out to Turner Valley in 2015, I guess. So we're still relatively new, I guess you could say. There's a lot of new folks in town. We moved out here because we wanted a little more space. We lived in Calgary for a lot of years. We both grew up in small towns. We both loved small towns. We both knew that we wanted to be out here. We actually came out for breakfast one day at the Chuck Wagon, and we said, we've been looking at houses in Okotoks and in Cochrane and in all sorts of other communities. Why aren't we looking here? It's another 10 minutes further. Why would I not look here? And we did, and we ended up sticking around, and we love it. It's been everything we wanted it to be. It's got space for our kids. Hopefully they don't torment your house too much. I know they like to get up to stuff, but it's been a blast.
They're still pretty young right now.
They are. The one's starting to get a little wild and hairy. I've got a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and the 5-year-old is I just wish I could take a tenth of his energy and bottle it up, because I could use it most days.
Well, he's very mobile, and he always has little friends rolling down the street in the cul-de-sac on various wheeled vehicles to pick him up, and then they see them going off.
Yeah, he's got his toys, and I mean, that's honestly one of the big selling features out here is he's got a little electric quad that he can ride around the cul-de-sac, and we feel comfortable, and that's why we want it to to be here, and that's why we love it.
Yeah, and everybody knows that there's children in that cul-de-sac. Everybody adjusts accordingly.
And if he's lighting fires or doing things that he's not supposed to be doing, I know that I'll hear about it too, and that's one of the things that comes great with small towns.
Right.
So.
Well, that's great. So you've been in the same house since you came out?
Yeah, that was the first house we moved into out here. So, yep.
Well, that's excellent. So I have to refer to my notes here. I can't remember everything. It has nothing to do with my age, but
I do the same thing, so don't worry about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So a little bit of background. You actually were involved in municipal politics in a way prior to running for council, right? You had was it a blog of some kind that you moderated, or?
Yeah, so I mean, when I moved here, the 2017 election, is it 2017? Yeah, 2017 election. I've always followed municipal politics, no matter where I am, and there's obviously a passionate group here who likes to follow that stuff. Somebody essentially said, hey, there's too much politics on the regular community forums. Why don't you guys take it somewhere else? So I just took the bull by the horns and started up a Facebook page that was essentially focused on Turner Valley municipal politics in general. And the real idea with it was just to kind of try to find a place where people could discuss things, have their opinions out, but to try to do it in a way that's kind of, factually based. And so my only rules were say whatever you want, right? Keep it civil, but try to be able to back anything up. And that was a huge part of what I did. So that really got me involved in the local politics. We went through that election, and I was new at the time to town, and I didn't have any inkling of maybe wanting to run, but it got me fired up about it, and so then the opportunity came around in 2019 with an opening on council, and I decided to take the plunge. So
that's excellent. So we were online with municipal politics before even the town was online, because it doesn't seem that long ago, but when you went on council, there was no online meetings, there was no live transmission, none of that happened. So that was one of the bigger changes in a short period of time.
And I mean, it was always a big thing for me, is that honestly in this day and age it should be online, right? Yeah. There's no reason that it shouldn't be. So that was a big thing that I always tried to push for, even from outside, and the wheels were kind of in motion. It eventually came into place. I think it was actually just before I ended up joining council, but it just makes it much easier for people to follow and understand what's going on. And I'm not gonna lie, as a councillor, it makes it easier for me to look back on some of the discussions that we've had historically, and to remember some of the things that we've talked about, or some of the presentations that we may have had at certain points in time. So there's no reason for that not to be the case. We shouldn't be working off of minutes. Yeah. Everybody's got a phone, everybody's got a camera. We should be streaming that out for the world.
Yeah, exactly. And the minutes I find maybe typical of administrations. Like I say, my work in the city of Calgary, but they seem to be very terse and more a list of events rather than any kind of content that happens. So it's really good to be able to see the content.
Yeah, and I think, a big part of that is it's hard to follow what actually goes on in a council just by following minutes, because, and honestly, this is guidance that comes from municipal affairs too, is to minimize the amount that's in the minutes to essentially be a record of decisions, and that's fine. It's good to know what the decisions were. That's what ultimately matters at the end of the day. But how you get to those decisions, I think, is critically important as well. So the video helps a ton with that.
Okay. So that maybe get us into a topic that I was going to cover a little bit later. But the municipal activities are regulated by the provincial government, right? So
correct.
Everything that you do is fairly well prescribed in one of the local acts of Alberta, Municipal Government Act.
Yep, yeah, the Municipal Government Act is essentially the Bible. I've heard the saying, the municipalities are a child of the provincial government, and ultimately in reality, the municipalities arise from the provincial government's power. The provincial government is the entity that grants that power to the municipal governments, so everything that we do has to follow those guidelines.
Right.
Yeah.
So when one looks from the outside, not having experience, it can be a little intimidating to look at the council proceedings sometime. We have Robert's Rules of Order or something that are defined and whatnot.
Yep.
All of this again filters down from the Municipal Government Act, otherwise known as the MGA.
Yep.
That people say. Were you able to adjust fairly well to that, or did you find a bit constraining, all the formality, and how did that happen?
It's a little bit intimidating, to be honest, the first time that you kind of sit down up there, because you have this inherent worry that everybody I think has this fear in the back of their mind that they're gonna break something, right, or you're gonna screw something up. At the end of the day, we're constrained by the act. Somebody will tell me if I'm doing something that I'm not in a position to be doing, and at any point in time during that proceeding, you can always stop and ask. And that was, I think, the biggest. I don't even remember the specific decision, but there was something where a decision was happening and there was about to be a vote, and I needed something clarified on the procedure. And you can call a point of procedure at any time. You can call a point of procedure to get clarity on what's going on. So once you realize that, it becomes a little more conversational, and ultimately, the meeting is run at the will of the chair, and if you've got a reasonable group of folks around you, you tend to find a way to navigate it, and you make sure that the decisions are made properly. But the rule book is less constraining than you might initially think it is, as far as how the conversation takes place. So I always just kind of tell people, don't be too worried about it. If you ever have a question, you call it a point of procedure to get your question out there, and,
Right.
and just make sure that you know what's
Yeah.
what's going on.
No
at
one's
any
going to
time.
put you down for wanting to know more.
You don't have to be a lawyer to do this job. At
Right.
the end of the day, you need to know the act. You need to know the principles of the act, how it governs what it is that we do, what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do. And we get some training along those lines to help us understand that.
Yeah, I wanted to move into that
Yeah.
a little bit. You know, what exactly did you experience with training, and what's available? There's both on-the-job training and maybe some formal training. Is that available for new members?
Yeah, so there's a lot of training provided provincially through municipal affairs. There's kind of they call it Muni 101. It's sort of the introduction to municipal politics course that, I mean, everybody should take, and it takes you through painful detail on what's involved and how to do everything.
How long is that course?
It's kind of a one-day course. Honestly, it's not that material, but it helps you to understand the operations and how the governance is supposed to operate. It works well to give you the basics. A lot of our actual procedure ends up getting governed by council procedure bylaw too, which is sort of a different layer. There's what's mandated by the MGA, and then there's the procedure, which is essentially council agrees on its own set of rules. So that one you don't necessarily get any formal training on. But what I've found is that, we've had some legislative services managers who they're essentially there to help make council run more smoothly, and so those are people that you can talk to and ask those sorts of questions of, and the biggest thing that I came to realize is never be afraid to ask a question about something, because somebody will be able to give you an answer, and you can decide whether that you agree with the approach or not, and you can go from there.
So the legislative service manager is an employee of the town, one of the senior employees that reports to the chief administration officer.
Yeah, so they technically report to the CAO, but I would say of all of the employees at a town, they're the one who has, aside from the CAO, who has the most interaction with council on a day-to-day basis. They're essentially responsible for making sure that the meetings run the way that they're supposed to, that they're advertised, that there's agendas, that there's minutes, all of those sorts of technical details, but they're also the people who tend to know the MGA the best, and they're the kind of person that you can kind of call up and say, I want to make a motion, and here's what I'm trying to accomplish, right? And those are the types of questions that you can have for somebody, and they'll tell you, well, you might try it this way, and you can agree or disagree. Ultimately, you have to make the decision on how you want to approach it. But that kind of advice can be very valuable.
So that gets into, that's the channel for you to inject ideas that either you have come up with yourself or talking to citizens about some things that they might want to see changed or improved or degraded or whatever. That's the vehicle. Is it a motion?
Yeah, and so there's a couple of ways that motions arise at a council, and so there will be motions that arise kind of from the operation of the business. So they'll come from, the CAO side of things where something will need to be done. They'll bring forward a report with, potential motions that might allow them to act in a way that handles the problem of the day. But there's a lot of council-led initiatives as well, and so the way that a council can bring forward activity is through, well, you can make a motion in a meeting, and part of this comes down to particular council's rule books, right? So our council procedure book says you can make a notice of motion to bring anything in front of council to discuss. That's essentially how you would bring a motion forward as a councillor. So there's a bit of a process involved in that. But you can also make motions regarding anything that's on the table, right? And so anything that's on an agenda, you could make motions arising from those discussions. And ultimately, those motions are how you direct the administration to do what you need to do.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is all rolling out very smoothly from you. It must have been a little different on your first day, though.
It was. You kind of just jump in there and they say, you sit here, and away you go, right? So, I mean, me coming in off cycle as well, I didn't have the immediate training. So definitely that first meeting was an intimidating one to sit down and just go, what do I do?
Yeah.
How do I vote? Do I put my hand up? Do I say aye?
Well, it's good to see the recovery didn't take very long.
It's honestly, you learn to make it happen, and I do really think a big thing is just not fearing asking questions and not fearing trying to move things forward, because there can be sometimes, I don't want to call it a resistance, but there can be, there's ways that things get done historically, and sometimes you might want to look at things a little bit differently, right? And there's ways for you to drive that, and it's through bringing a motion, and that's essentially council's prerogative to do that.
Right. So I'll probe that a little later. What I wanted to talk about now was you mentioned legislative services and the CAO, who we see at all the council meetings. Who else do you deal with in the town employee structure, the administrative structure? And what are the rules around that?
Yeah, so in from a technical perspective, council's only employee is the CAO. So from a technical perspective, that is our only employee. That is the only person that sort of has to answer the phone for us at the end of the day. But the reality is, in a small town like ours, we know most of the people around the office, right? And so, I stop in to get mail and talk to Hazel, or you have a question on planning and you can call the planning department, right? And there's lots of people that you can talk to, sort of just as you can in your capacity as a citizen as well. You can pick up the phone and call folks.
Right.
But you have to be cautious about not directing people to do things through those channels, right? So as far as actual council action, it always has to come through the council table, through the CAO, and then be implemented by the organizations.
Yeah. But you may talk if there's a need to gather some information.
Absolutely, yeah, and you can ask for that information, have it brought to council meetings. You can call people up on a question on planning when you're thinking about. This is a great example, is that when you're thinking about doing something that might be, planning related or potentially taxation related, you might email those people and say, look, I'm looking at a potential motion, here's what I'm thinking about doing, can I get your thoughts on this, right? Or can I get this piece of information from you? And that's, they're all very, very typically open to providing that. Now, at some point in time, ultimately they can say no if they want to, but you can always go through the CAO if needed too.
Yeah. So that gets to a more general question of the working environment. It's generally not a hostile working environment, I'm gathering. It's a fairly friendly working environment. Well, formality doesn't overrule, but there's enough formality to let you get things done.
Yeah, and I think it's in a big city, there's a lot of formality, I think, by necessity. I don't know what the right answer is, but in a smaller town, I think you just try to get things done, and you try to ultimately, the employees of the town work at the will of council indirectly through a CAO, but it's congenial, but obviously there's difficult conversations as well. So I always try to take the approach of, you don't want to be too, and it's in my view the same way that you want to manage a business. You want to be friendly and professional with everybody, but at the end of the day, when you're the one who has to make difficult decisions, you also have to have some level of separation as well, I think, right? And that's critically important to good governance. So I think Todd's gonna